So welcome everyone. My name is Hugh Long. I'm the president of the Board of Trustees of the Louisiana Philharmonic Orchestra. I also sit on the board of the League. Welcome to the Toolbox session, a discussion with Robert Flanagan. We have one piece of shameless commerce to deal with, which is on everybody's tables, is an order form for those of you, and I know there's only one or two of you who haven't already read Bob's book. There's the opportunity to get it at a substantial discount, 20% I believe, that will continue through the summer from the Yale University Press. And this is what it looks like, and I see a number of copies already in the room. This session is a continuation of what Jesse expressed as one of the conference themes this morning, a civil and candid dialogue around tough issues. In May of 2003, a little over 9 years ago, a collection of musicians, staff, and trustees from more than a dozen orchestras were in a meeting convened by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, discussing issues related to orchestral culture and governance. Taking you back to those days of yesteryear, the dot-com bubble had burst. The economy was in recession. Orchestras' fiscal positions were under stress. One evening during that convening, and admittedly this took place in a bar, a number of us, some of whom are here at conference, suggested that in and around the discussions we were having, or rather right in the midst of them, there was an elephant in the living room, which we chose at the time to describe as the shitty economy. If only we had known, I wonder what adjective we would be using to describe the economy today, since we have now the Great Recession rather than just one of an ordinary garden variety of 9 years ago. As a result of the suggestion that there was an elephant in the room, we embarked on a journey to try to define the economic circumstances of orchestras. And that in turn, shortly thereafter, led to asking Bob Flanagan to bring some professional economic expertise to that journey. And Bob's book, The Perilous Life of Symphony Orchestras, is an important way station on that journey that we're going to be talking about today. Bob is the Konosuke Matsushita Professor of International Labor Economics and Policy Analysis at Stanford University. He did his undergraduate work in economics at Yale, saw the error of his ways being on the East Coast and came to the West Coast and did his master's and PhD work in economics at UC Berkeley. After that, there was a stint as senior staff economist in the President's Council of Economic Advisors and a faculty stint at the University of Chicago, but then he really found the promised land and left all of that stuff behind him and joined the faculty at Stanford University, which, of course, I have some biases with respect to, since that's where I did my graduate work as well. Bob has been on the faculty at Stanford since 1975, continues to teach there in the best of all possible circumstances, he assures me, namely that as Professor Emeritus, he's gotten rid of all the onerous duties like going to faculty committee meetings and gets to do what he really likes to do, which is teach. The other thing you need to know about Bob is that starting at an early age, I believe in single digits. He began playing the clarinet, and for over 30 years has been playing clarinet and saxophone in a big band jazz orchestra in the San Francisco Bay Area. So please let's have a warm welcome for Bob Flanagan.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Hugh, and thank you, everyone. It's a genuine pleasure to be able to discuss some of the findings in this book with such a well-informed audience. The study that I'm going to draw from in this talk starts out with a basic paradox, as I see it, which is that symphony music probably has never been performed as well as it's performed today, yet the finances of most symphony orchestras are fragile. And it's not just U.S. orchestras. No orchestra in the world, as far as I've been able to determine, earns enough through its performance revenues from concerts, recordings, and broadcasts to cover its performance expenses. And in a nutshell, the purpose of my study was to ask why this is the case and what can be done about it. The study details, and I guess I should say this is an industry study. The study details are drawn from an analysis of data in the OSR reports that you all send in annually, to which I've added some government data on the economic characteristics of the different areas in which orchestras are located, and some data on the opera industry in an effort to explore competition between two performing arts. The sample I ended up with consists of 63 symphony orchestras, each of which were one of the top 50 in the United States for at least 2 of the years in my sample period, which was the concert seasons from 1987 through 2005. Today, what I want to do is focus on 4 key ideas that come out of that study that I believe should inform actions by symphony orchestras as they consider individual policies. And then we will turn to a discussion to get your views on that. So the first idea is the distinction between cyclical and structural deficits. And this goes to a remark that Hugh just made about the genesis of the thought that some economic analysis in the industry would be useful. There was a time 4 or 5 years ago when people did not, I would say, clearly appreciate the distinction between these 2 aspects of a symphony's deficit. I think of a cyclical deficit as the economic weather. It's a temporary consequence of economic recessions, obviously can be deeply serious, but it is reversible. On the other hand, it's not reversible by and large by orchestra policies. Reversing the cyclical aspect of a deficit is really a task for macroeconomic policy to get the economy going again. The reason, incidentally, why recessions worsen orchestra's financial balance, when you think about it, is because the revenues are far more sensitive to a deterioration in the economy than the expenses are. And conversely, when you come out of a recession, the revenues are more sensitive than the expenses. Moreover, once an orchestra goes into a recession and its performance deficit increases, the economic circumstances confronting most donors reduce non-performance income just when an orchestra needs it most. That's a cyclical deficit. Most of my talk today, virtually everything after this first slide, is going to be directed at structural deficits, however, which I think of as the economic climate within which orchestras operate. Or to put it differently, it's the situations orchestras face after the cyclical problems have been taken care of, or in ordinary language, after an economy is back at full employment. Now, the structural deficits result from something quite different, something which in the trade has come to be known as the cost disease. And trying to put that idea in a nutshell, the basic problem is differences in productivity growth rates between orchestras and other performing arts on the one hand, and the goods-producing sector on the other hand. I want to emphasize that this difference in productivity growth is nobody's fault. It's inherent in the nature of performance. When you look at the goods-producing sector, you can see how technical changes over the years have reduced the labor input necessary for producing individual units of output. But when you think about the performing arts, composers and in the theater playwrights fix for all time what the labor requirements are. So again, the difference in the productivity growth is more or less inherent, something that performing arts organizations must live with. The reason it creates economic difficulties is pay must increase at roughly the same rate in both the goods producing and the performing arts sectors in order to retain people in the performing arts sector. So in the goods producing sector, pay increases tend to follow productivity so that there's not a lot of upward pressure on cost per unit of output. But when those same pay increases occur in the arts sector without the productivity increase to offset them, you get ever-increasing cost increases. And in the US and every other country where I've been able to find data, the plain fact is that cost per unit of cost per performance increase more rapidly than the cost of other products and services in society. Most other products and services, I should say. So the problem with the cost disease is that ultimately you get this relentless cost pressure. The reason this distinction between cyclical and structural is important is first to recognize the temporary and permanent nature of these two deficits. The cyclical can be escaped eventually, as we're seeing, but the structural is there more or less forever. And as the group that Hugh referred to stressed in their final report, different policies are required to address the two deficits. From an orchestra's point of view, dealing with a cyclical deficit is like riding the waves, or in more practical terms, trying to build up reserves in good times to handle the extra cyclical deficit of bad times. But when you talk about structural deficits, you're not dealing with a wave. You're talking about a permanent and permanently increasing cost situation, and that requires addressing the basic business model. The total deficit is the sum of the two, and I've come up with this picture to try to illuminate what I just said. On the vertical axis, you have the size of the deficit. On the horizontal axis, time evolves from left to right. If you look at the extreme left side, I've drawn it so that it's a period of full employment, possibly the middle part of this past decade. All you have in a period of full employment is a structural deficit. Then you run into a recession, for example, the one that began in late 2007, and to that structural deficit is the cyclical deficit. Eventually, when you come out of the recession, full employment is restored and the orchestra is left with only a structural deficit. Now, I want to, excuse me, I want to turn now to the second of the four.
Bob, could I ask you to define your terms? Do you mean deficits as total revenues minus expenses, or do you mean the performance income gap?
I mean total revenues minus expenses. The second general point I'd like to make that I think is important to be at the forefront of all discussions of symphony policy is that the crucial feature of structural deficits, as the picture we just looked at shows, is that they grow over time. I say crucial in the following sense. The unfortunate arithmetic of the cost disease is that when a symphony orchestra puts together a set of revenues that cover expenses in one year, so the budget is in balance, and can repeat that the following year, there's no guarantee that it will cover the deficit the following year, because the unwelcome fact about structural deficits is that they tend to increase over time. And in my analysis of the data for the United States between 1987 and 2005 using the OSR data, the relentless increase in the deficits, even after you corrected for cyclical fluctuations, was quite clear. The other point I want to make regarding this growth of structural deficits all over time is it may have something to do, well, let me start that sentence again, a misunderstanding about this characteristic of symphony economics may have something to do with the emergence of what some people have referred to as donor fatigue over time. I've never seen a single clear definition of donor fatigue in the few years that it's been around, but one aspect of it is that people resent being asked to make larger and larger donations to symphonies. And a number of people in the business have mentioned encountering this. To some extent, I think the donors who feel that way misunderstand the basic aspect of structural deficits and perhaps would benefit by understanding why symphonies must come back and ask for more and more money. In any event, it's just a thought of whether part of the donor fatigue is a lack of understanding of this fundamental fact. The point I want to make before we leave the topic of cost disease and that is because when people hear about the cost disease and the ever-increasing costs in the arts organizations that exceed cost increases also, there's sometimes a worry about whether society can afford the arts. And as a matter of analysis, the answer is clearly that society can, if it so chooses. The point about affording it, affording the increasing money costs of society is while the costs are going up due to the forces I just spoke about, it's also true that in the goods-producing sector of the economy, productivity is increasing, and with that, real incomes are increasing. So the money resources are there. It's also true that performances, like many other things in life, require both cash and time, and we're all too aware that our time budgets never expand, unlike our income budgets. And then finally, even though as a matter of analysis, there's no, the resources that are there for society to afford the arts, of course it's a matter of choice. And if you look at two cost disease industries, symphonies and universities, you sometimes see differences in finances because of differences in demand. Okay, given the financial flows that are important in the orchestra sector, the third general point I want to make and develop, and this takes the most time to develop, is that any policies that symphonies consider will fall under one of three broad strategies. First, raising performance revenue growth. Secondly, reducing performance expense growth. Those two strategies go to narrowing the basic performance deficit. And the third strategy goes to filling in whatever performance deficit is left, increasing non-performance income growth. Now, what strikes me most and what I think is most important in the U.S. context about this third strategy is the diversity of sources. You have non-performance income coming from the public and private sectors as well as returns on investment. Look at the array of different decision makers involved in producing these different sources of non-performance income. This diversity produces the result that in the U.S. situation, the decision-making is so uncoordinated that basically there's no guarantee that the amount of non-performance income that a symphony receives will cover its performance deficit. That is the balance between performance revenues now and performance expenses in any given year. What I want to do, and this incidentally I think produces much of the uncertainty and fragility in the fact that in the OSR data that I analyzed, you found that while on average more more symphonies averaged a deficit, 46 in fact, than averaged a surplus, 17. All symphonies moved in and out of deficit and surplus status. It's this unpredictability to a large degree in the extent to which any year's non-performance income will cover the deficit that produces that. Well, these three broad strategies are obvious. What may be less obvious is what came out of some of the analyses that I'll report to you, and I'll tip you off to the conclusion right now. None of these strategies alone can produce financial balance, and I'll provide the wiring for that statement over the next few minutes. But while any policy you might consider is going to fall under one of these three strategies, none of the strategies alone will achieve the financial balance that orchestras seek. Let me start with the strategy of raising performance revenue growth, largely a matter, as you know, of building and retaining audiences, pricing tickets. The challenges, as this group is also well aware of and the book documents, is declining attendance, the fact that simply adding concerts produces sharply diminishing returns in terms of attendance. Everyone's aware that symphony audiences have also above average, the key demographic is high income and high education, but regrettably, each successive cohort of high income, high education people has participated less in concert attendance. And this I think is important for thinking about symphony issues, other arts performances. And it goes beyond the arts. Many other traditional uses of leisure time are in decline. When you see that it's not restricted to symphony attendance, that the decline is not restricted, in some ways it reframes the questions that one might ask regarding how symphonies deal with the difficulties they confront. How much of the problem is really unique to symphonies or the particular characteristics of symphonies and their policies? What are the limits on what orchestra policies alone can achieve? And how much of the problem might be addressed by collaborations with other arts organizations that are going through the same experiences? In my work on the factors that influence attendance per concert, for the orchestra policies, ticket price levels influence. I found, as have others, that attendance is responsive to prices, but not very responsive to prices, so that raising ticket prices will increase, will increase performance revenues to a symphony. The problem that's harder to get at is that even though you increase revenues, you will lose some attendance, and some of that attendance may also be contributors. The second factor I looked at is ticket price structures. The idea here is pricing tickets to different classes of consumers or different seats in the audience according to their willingness to pay. Now, many orchestras already do a fair amount with this, but when you look at orchestras and see only 2 or 3 or 4 ticket price points, one has the feeling that there's a lot more that could be done to increase revenues. In the book, I report on an interesting experiment that was conducted with great success at the Chicago Symphony, for example, on this. Marketing expenditures increase attendance also. That's the good news. The other news is they're subject to diminishing returns, so that additional marketing expenditures at some point produce smaller and smaller attendance gains. Now, I want to go back briefly in this last point to the fact that structural deficits grow over time. How many of these solutions grow over time is a good question to ask. For example, the ticket price structure is an example of something that may give you a one-time improvement in the balance, but it's not something that's going to grow with the deficit. Marketing expenditures, ticket price levels. You can raise ticket price levels every year if you choose to, but you incur some cost. Many of the policies that fall under influencing revenue seem to be policies that produce one-time gains, but are not going to produce endless gains year after year. I also looked at the effect of community economic characteristics. Not surprisingly, increases in population are associated with higher attendance. The main reason I put this on the slide is to remind us that to some extent, orchestras have to live with the luck of where they're located. Some of what they can achieve on the revenue side depends on the economic characteristics of their community, which varies hugely across the league membership. I also looked briefly, as I said I would, at competition between the arts. In this case, opera was the only art I could get significant data on, and found some statistically significant result, but it was too small to be of major consequence. So it's not something I emphasize particularly in the book. Now, I said a moment ago that each of the broad strategies would improve things, but none could do the job by itself. And the limitation to the audience growth strategy is that filling every seat in the house will not eliminate the performance deficits. The experiment I did was the following. I noticed in the data that on average, orchestras sell only about 70% of their seats, and so I just said, what if they sold all of their seats at their existing ticket prices? Now that's a pretty optimistic assumption because they're not selling all their seats at the ticket prices, but I decided to take an optimistic approach. And what I found when you did the arithmetic was simply that filling every seat in the house at existing ticket prices would not eliminate the performance deficits of the vast majority of orchestras. I'll add that, again, on this theme of some solutions being only one time, even if you could fill the house, you'd get the relief. Once you fill the house, you can't go any further, but the structural deficit is going to continue to grow. Okay, the second major strategy, that's all I want to say in our brief time about the strategy of raising performance revenues, revenue growth. Now I want to turn to reducing performance expense growth. And this is easily the most conflictual of the three strategies because in large measure it involves the incomes of artistic and non-artistic personnel, which also are the cost to orchestras. And much of the cost results from collective bargaining. And the one thing I want to remind people is that in every collective bargaining agreement I've seen has two signatures on it. So if one has concerns about the outcome of collective bargaining, it's as relevant to ask why management feels comfortable agreeing to it as to ask why unions push for it. What I've done in the book, and we'll do here quickly, is just present some facts that I discovered as I worked on this that might condition discussions about expense growth. One is that since 1987, U.S. symphony orchestra musicians' pay increased more rapidly than pay growth elsewhere in the economy. The collective bargaining agreements in U.S. orchestras have over time converted artistic expenses from variable to fixed costs. When I looked at the pay situation of musicians in other countries, I found that the pay of U.S. musicians are relatively high and place them in a comparatively high position in the U.S. income distribution, that is, compared to musicians in other countries. In most years, changes in musicians' pay showed little sensitivity to the financial balance of their orchestra. Turning from the labor cost to marketing, I've already stressed the diminishing returns. So in deciding how far to carry marketing expenditures, it's important to assess the incremental effects. If an orchestra is able to slow the rate of growth of expenses, it does create a permanent solution because the lower rate of growth applies in all subsequent years. On the other hand, as with strategy 1, there's a limitation to strategy 2, and that eventually slowing the growth of labor costs threatens the ability to retain artistic and non-artistic personnel. So the conclusion with strategy 2, as with strategy 1, is that although slowing expense growth unquestionably improves and can contribute to a personal solution, the strategy alone won't do the job. This brings us to the final broad strategy, increasing non-performance income growth. Remember the diversity of sources there. I want to start with government support, where, of course, the standard view is that other countries support their orchestras through direct subsidies, and to a large extent, the US government does not. And if you focus on direct subsidies, that view is exactly correct. What's different about the US is the use of indirect subsidies. And by indirect subsidies, I mean incentives provided by the tax system for people to donate to orchestras, other arts organizations, and more broadly, other, other charitable organizations. Economists call these charitable donations tax expenditures, and I think it's the right term because this is revenue that the government could collect and spend, but instead allows citizens to spend for specific purposes. When I started the study, about 75%, 3/4 of the assistance that US orchestras received from the government was tax expenditures. The other 25% were direct subsidies. By the end of the study, as you can see on the slide, fully 96% of the government support received by US orchestras came from tax expenditures rather than the diminishing funds from the NEA. This difference of approach in the US has a number of implications that are worth bearing in mind. It blurs the distinction between private and public support, because some private support is effectively money that the government could have collected from you and spent itself, but is allowed you to spend for particular purposes. It sure decentralizes the decisions about what constitutes supportable art in comparison to countries where the primary method of subsidy is direct production subsidies, where decisions are often made by arts elites and so on. And then, as I'm sure all of you are all too aware of, the future of so-called private support depends importantly on national tax policy, something I want to return to in a moment or two. I'm going to, because of time, I'm going to skip over this, other than just to mention another approach to subsidies is to subsidize demand by basically providing vouchers for arts use. Lovely background music. Okay. Instead, what I'd like to do is just give you a quick snapshot of the structure of revenue and expenses in a country, Australia, where there's extensive direct government subsidies of the arts in the orchestras, and the United States, which we've just discussed. You can see the difference at a glance, where in 2003, the government support was 61%, constitutes 61% of the revenues of Australian orchestras. If you look over at the US and take only the direct subsidies, just 5%. On the other hand, when you look at private support, you see it's the mirror image. Very small amount in Australia, large amount in the US, some of which, as I've suggested, might really be considered a form of public support. Turning next to a comparison of expenses in the two countries. The main point I would make here is when you have a country with really substantial government support, some of the expenses that U.S. orchestras must incur to survive become irrelevant. Fundraising expense, for example, some of the marketing expense. So you see very tiny slices, very small slices in the Australia case relative to the U.S., and hence, as a result, the proportion of expense that goes to our artistic endeavors is larger. The future of private support, to a large extent, depends on government tax policies, as I just said. It's clear to anyone living in the United States that the government needs, given the size of deficits, to raise more revenue, but there's a significant debate about how to do it. From the single-minded interests of symphony orchestras, the best outcome would be to raise tax rates because it would create a stronger incentive for the private donations that make up tax expenditures. I need hardly tell you there's substantial political resistance to this in some quarters, and a more likely compromise seems to move in the direction of leaving tax rates more or less unchanged, but broadening the tax base. This could be more threatening to arts organizations depending on which tax expenditures are eliminated, because broadening the tax base really means eliminating some of the tax expenditures. The worst possible case, of course, would be to eliminate the charitable deduction. On the other hand, that's hardly the largest tax expenditure in the U.S. tax code, and it's not clear at this time that that would be the focus. There is an intermediate proposal concerning broadening the tax base that would be more congenial, and that would be setting a tax expenditure level, but not, excuse me, but letting the taxpayer allocate it to specifics. Now, I want to skip ahead because of the time here. Fundraising expenses are productive, but more so for large than small orchestras. And I want to say a few words to conclude on endowment management. Most endowments are supposed to provide support in perpetuity. And it's a tricky business because it involves balancing the interests of unrepresented future concert patrons and musicians against the interest of current concert patrons and musicians. In order to do this, you have to select a payout rate that allows for the increase in the costs over time. In my work, I found that many orchestras adopt unsustainably high payout rates, which effectively is shortchanging future generations of concert patrons and musicians. Secondly, the second point on endowments concerns financial policy. Financial markets offer trade-offs between risk and return, so that you would expect that organizations with riskier portfolios would have higher returns. When you look at this picture for orchestras, you see nothing of the sort. What this picture has is the return on endowment investments on the vertical axis, the investment risk or the volatility of investments on the horizontal axis. Each dot represents the risk and return for an individual U.S. orchestra, averaged over 98 to 2005. You can see what you've got is a random scatter. That is, for a given degree of risk in their portfolio, some orchestras earn much less than others, or alternatively, for a given return, some incur much more risk than others. Clearly, the investment of endowment resources could be improved. Last endowment point, can you solve the deficit problem with larger endowments? Even before I answer that question, I want to say there's a general policy problem for orchestras here, because contributions to endowments may be diversions from contributions for operating expenses. And no orchestra can build endowments while ignoring the operating deficits. What I did was simply to say, how large would endowments have to be at a prudent payout rate to cover the performance deficit, difference between performance revenues and expenses? And they were orders of magnitude higher than what you see in U.S. orchestras. So again, you come to this conclusion that endowments alone could not do the job. The general conclusion is that none of the three broad strategies by itself can remove the deficits. That's it. That's
Thank you,
the
Bob.
summary.
Excellent. We're going to have a little less than 30 minutes for questions to Bob and discussion about this. We have a mic in the back. We have a mic up front. I'd like folks to state their name, their organization, and their position. There's usually a premise for a question. I'd like the premise and the question itself to be somewhere in the 30 to 45-second range. We'll try to get as many questions and responses in the time we have available. So let's kick it off there, Robert.
Robert Levine, Milwaukee Symphony, and other things. This is not a question. Can I go ahead anyway?
How long is the non-question?
A couple minutes if I'm succinct.
Okay, go.
I do have a couple questions, but I wanted to suggest that I think there are at least two conceptual flaws in the analysis, which I'm not going to try to address technically because I don't doubt the numbers. The first is that I think there is a much bigger divide functionally between the orchestras in your study than you seem to give credit for. Between certainly the big, successful, what we call on the union side, flagship orchestras, LA, San Francisco, New York, those, and orchestras like mine. Now mine is, I think, the biggest of the non-52-week orchestras, but I don't think it's atypical of a lot. For example, just to give one example, you cite musician pay going up above the, the rate of general pay increase in the economy. And my orchestra pay has gone down in real terms about 15% over the past 15 years. I think that's more typical of the orchestras not in the top tier than are the compensation figures you cite. And it really makes a difference if you think about those orchestras as being, they look the same, but they're not the same. The bigger point is, I think your analysis essentially assumes that the mission of orchestras is to sell tickets for concerts in their home halls. And I think that's a forgivable error because, in fact, a lot of people in business think that too. But it's not. And if you look at orchestras as what they're supposed to be, and what, in fact, our mission statements generally say we are, which is organizations that provide symphonic music to their communities. And we do that on an inherently nonprofit basis. Much of this analysis, I think, becomes interesting but not relevant in quite the fundamental way that I think people are seeing it. I will give you an example. I know, because my wife runs it, a smallish nonprofit agency in social services. They have no performance income. They're doing fine. They're raising money. They're raising increasing sums of money. You would not think of analyzing them the same way that you analyze us, because they don't look anything like an entertainment company that sells tickets to make money. Our mission is not to sell tickets to make money. We sell tickets as a tool, but in fact we are fundamentally nonprofits, and I think your analysis on some very basic level misses that. And I think if you think of orchestras as nonprofits, then you start thinking, well, does the Bommel effect affect the orchestra's ability to raise money? I don't see how it does, because that seems more related to the general health of the economy and not in, the ratio of productivity improvements. It just becomes a whole different way of thinking. And as I said, there are a lot of people that still think of us as high-end entertainment companies, but we're not. That's not to say we don't very significant problems. And I think the one that you point out, although oddly enough don't put enough emphasis on, is the problem with audiences. Because if we don't have audiences, why do we exist? But the nature of how those audiences and how the communities pay for the orchestra, it could be very different from what you're analyzing. We could have orchestras that don't sell a ticket and do fine. You cannot have an orchestra that doesn't raise any money. Fundamentally, we are nonprofits. And the bottom line for a nonprofit is not the bottom line.
Okay, is this on? Can you hear me? Oh, good. In response to the two questions, as I said at the beginning, you're right, this is an industry study, so that it reached conclusions for an industry average and does not say anything about individual symphonies. You could, if there were agreement on what the tiers were, certainly divide the overall sample up into smaller groups, particularly if you thought there were different pathologies, if I can put it that way, for the top tier and the lower tier orchestras. One interesting implication of that part of your remarks to me is they seem to signal with your wage example growing inequality within the orchestra sector, which is something the book does not investigate, but would be a topic certainly worthy of more research. With regard to your second remark, I hear what you're saying and remain befuddled about how the objective, as you put it, is gained if it cannot be supported economically.
Well, first of all, I think the first issue could maybe on a technical level be addressed if the averages were not always means. Because one way of taking the tiers out is how many people are in the top tier. If you do a median average of that, you have a lot of people whose income is decreasing, say, which I think is the case, and some whose income is, then the average change depending on how you calculate. No, the issue of supporting it is still the same, but you know, the whole issue of the performance gap becomes not the kind of critical deal breaker that you're portraying it as. In fact, you actually define in the book that the structural deficit is the gap between performance income and performance expenses, which A, is not the way we define it, and B, I think, again, misses the point, because more and more, for reasons that are not just formal, I think, we are depending on fundraising. And our ability to fundraise is not limited so much by the things you analyze as by our attractiveness and our value to the community as a whole.
Let me just twist that around this way. Last time I looked, dollars are fungible. And I'm happy to put money in my checking account from whatever source, whether it's from selling a ticket or getting an annual fund gift or getting dividends and interest from an endowment or having the NEA write me a check or a corporation underwrite a Parks concert or whatever. So what really is the rationale for putting it in two big categories, performance and non-performance? Shouldn't I just be trying to get money wherever I can get it?
Well, I think it's important, first of all, to understand why performance revenues don't cover performance expenses, because one way of solving a problem would be simply by narrowing the deficits in the first place, if that were feasible. As far as covering the deficit you end up with, I think you're absolutely right that money is fungible and you don't care which source it comes from. The reason for discussing the different sources, as I did today, is I was struck in using the league data at how disparate the experience of individual symphonies were on almost any dimension of finances you cared to look at. The structure of their non-performance income, which goes to the fungibility issue. The structure of their expenses, the structure of their performance revenues. They're all over the lot. And this may be part of Robert's complaint. Now, I use that variance to get the results that I report to you. And I think I would stay with that unless it were demonstrated that it's not just that there's dispersion around an average, but there are, as I said earlier, different pathologies, different groups of orchestras that for various reasons should be analyzed separately. That's certainly doable.
My name is Kate Better. I'm Chief Executive of Symphony Services International, which represents the 6 Australian symphony orchestras, which Bob showed an interesting pie chart up there of. I'm just wondering, Bob, when I read your book, I sort of got quite depressed about the whole structural deficit. And although there are many other things that orchestras do, obviously we all need to be able to survive economically. And I wondered whether you have optimism that orchestras in the main will be able to combine these strategies or come up with other strategies so that in 100 years we all are still existing, or are you as depressed about it as I am?
Well, I resisted making forecasts in the book because, well, the response to your question is the one quasi-forecast I did make. It did seem to me, in looking at the recent history and the data, that a likely outcome, which is depressing, is that orchestras would become more concentrated. And that's because under the US system, bankruptcies are possible in the orchestra world. You cannot count on a government to bail them out. And the pattern of most bankruptcies has been that they occur in smaller orchestras and often in areas where the economic base is weaker, going to my earlier general point that some of the things that affect an orchestra's economic health are way beyond their control, the luck or good or bad luck of where they're located. That's the only thing approximating a forecast I feel confident in making. I don't think classical music is through because there are too many people who love it and they can find ways to support it. But it doesn't seem to be supported as broadly as in the past. And until we understand much more than anyone does, as far as I can see, about these attendance trends, I think it's hard to say more. I mean, you need to know really what it would take to reverse the kinds of attendance trends not only we have experienced, but countries around the world have experienced.
Good afternoon. Alan Jordan with the Vermont Symphony Orchestra. Mr. Flanagan, when you made the observation about increased marketing expenditures having a positive result on revenues, did you drill down any further to see which specific marketing expenditures might have the best effect?
Yeah, within the league data, the marketing expenditures are divided up to some degree by specific media. And in the appendix to the chapter you're talking about, it presents the results by different media. I can tell you that the broad conclusion I stated, that the expenditures were subject to diminishing returns, as I recall, held up for each of the media that you could tease out of the OSR data.
But it was media versus personnel or other expenses under marketing.
Yeah, there's media and there's telephone. I'm sorry, it's been so long since I did it, I can't remember the entire spreadsheet now. Yeah.
Marion Casey, South Dakota Symphony. I'm wondering, looking at this, what other categories or varieties of revenue might have growth opportunities, like in the 20th century, in the golden days, there were orchestras that made a lot of their money through recordings, so it wasn't, it was performance-related income, but it was much more scalable than the live concerts because you can press more LPs or burn more CDs at a lot less cost than throwing another concert or adding more seats to your concert hall. And I'm wondering what other growth possibilities there are out there of those sorts of related revenue potential, either performance related or other sources of non-performance.
I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask because I'm seldom on the cusp of new technology, to be perfectly frank. My general sense is that if you're trying to raise revenues, probably it's more promising to look for new sources or expanded sources of non-performance revenues than performance revenues. For the reasons I mentioned earlier, there are constraints on how far most orchestras would be willing to raise prices, given that there are some attendance consequences. Some orchestras own halls and can get some rental income, but that turns out to be a trivial aspect of their revenues, basically. The more promising avenue is to try and develop more sources. I don't think there are more sources of non-performance income than I discussed earlier, but to get more out of those sources, either through better management of investments, through acquiring more donors, and so on. But as I've stressed throughout, and as you see in the summary on the slide here, that alone will not do it, just like everything else I've talked about.
Santa Rosa Symphony, Northern California. I'm wondering if you identified any correlations between the different income source opportunities, because I don't think all the income opportunities are created equal. And what I mean by that is, our sense is that a key is growing the audience. And if you're not growing the audience, because that subscriber, the single ticket buyer turns into the subscriber, turns into the donor, turns into planned giving, estate giving, and endowment. And so that the income sources are not necessarily separate at all. And I'm wondering if you looked at all into the correlation for orchestras among those.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The short answer is no. And the longer answer is no, because it's a little difficult to do with the league data, which are average categories for individual orchestras. If I followed your question, you'd want to follow the behavior. You'd want data on individual patrons, I think, to see how they changed their status over time and how that affected the amount they spent on the symphony orchestra. I think it's a great question, but I wasn't able to address it in the OSR data.
One of the observations that Robert made back at the beginning was that at least in his orchestra, there has been a decline in real income. And certainly, depending on the period of time, I've observed that in some other orchestras as well. And I've certainly heard in some of the media reports about real incomes declining outside of the orchestra sector during this decade. It's certainly possible, is it not, that we could have a situation where orchestral incomes are going up faster than others, but they're all falling. And also the question is, rates of increase are interesting, but where did we start off and what are the absolute levels as we look at this through the study period?
Yeah, well, there has been a truncation, even decline in periods of real incomes generally. So to a certain extent, the results for some orchestral musicians track with that. Although there's no inherent connection between the incomes of orchestral musicians and earnings in the economy generally, except to the extent that earnings elsewhere become a benchmark, if you will, during negotiations over what symphony wages should be. I'm sorry, I've lost the second part of your question.
The second was
Yeah.
Rates of increase are interesting, but they also have to take into account where did you start from, and what are the absolute levels, regardless of rates of change.
With respect to wages or everything?
Let's say wages.
Okay. Well, that was one of the reasons why I looked into international comparisons of wages and where it put symphony musicians in their national income distributions, which I thought would be interesting, and I had no idea what the comparison would yield, actually. And from that perspective, if you view the position of musicians elsewhere in the world as a kind of benchmark as far as levels go, American musicians have both higher real incomes, more purchasing power from their salaries, and are positioned higher in the national income distribution than workers abroad.
Henry?
I have two questions.
Say your name for everyone.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Henry Perilous. I'm a bassist in the Cleveland Orchestra. I had one question until your last statement, Bob. Now I have two.
That's what my students say.
I think that in the international comparisons, I think that there is a flaw in the comparison because the very top American orchestras draw on an international labor pool. People move from Europe, from Asia to play in the top American orchestras, and there's some movement also to the top European orchestras. But the very top European orchestras, Berlin, Vienna, the large German orchestras are not included in your comparisons. So I think that you don't have the same mix of orchestras. You don't have the other orchestras, the European orchestras that draw on an international worldwide labor pool. I don't know how you would do that, but it seems that it's not there. The other question I had, though, was, did you find a correlation between the rate of increase in musician compensation, which varies widely among this pool of orchestras, and the overall financial balance of the individual orchestras over that time? Did orchestras that had greater rates of increase in salary have larger imbalances in their deficits over time?
What I did, I'm not sure if I heard your last question correctly, so just come back if I've misinterpreted it. What I did was to ask statistically the question, to what extent does the current surplus or deficit position of an orchestra influence the wages, the wage increases, excuse me. And the answer was that there was no significant relationship between the two.
Actually, about the compensation question, I mean, I have to say, as a musician, I found the book interesting and in many ways disturbing. The focus on orchestra compensation is the only thing I minded. For a variety of reasons. One is because, of course, you get to the table and studies like this. And, I have to say, I think the book is a far more balanced and actually interesting and helpful document than the original study was. But, this is a field where people will pull out statistics and, use them very selectively. But one of the interesting things that you point out, but has not gotten a lot of attention, is the fact for all the emphasis on musician compensation, the non-artistic component of orchestra budgets has typically gone up a little faster, which to me raises a lot of issues and suggests a lot of things, but certainly raises questions about the relevance of volume, because presumably the non-artistic components are seeing some productivity increases, and yet seems to take a lot obvious explanation is there's a lot more work to do. The other point I'd like to make is something that I think Henry was trying to get at, and I'll just say it flat out, which is that, at least in this country, and I think probably internationally too, the correlation between long-term institutional health and musician compensation, if anything, is negative. Which is to say, in this country at least, orchestras that we consider the flagships are generally, over the long term, healthy. And they're paying the best, and they're also, at this point, paying increasingly more than orchestras like mine, which, you know, are not as institutionally healthy, and have never been. So I really, you know, I think, again, the correlations are not fundamentally economic or even statistical. They have far more to do with institutional tradition, institutional health, the issue, some extent get into the health of the region, but also the traditions of the region, which is why, you know, Rust Belt cities historically tend to be better than the Sun Belt cities in supporting these things, even though there's a lot of new wealth in the Sun Belt, the traditions are not there to donate. Which I think goes back to my original point that orchestras are funded because people view them as valuable to the community, not because, you know, they can't sell tickets or their ticket because of all the other factors.
May I just?
Yeah.
First of all, it is correct, and you didn't have the comparison to see it, so I should confirm what was just said, that the share of artistic expenses and total expenses of orchestras on average has declined over the period of the study. Yet at the end of the period, it was still 49%, if memory serves. So it is the case that small changes in artistic expenses have a very large impact on an orchestra's budget, which is why they continue to get a lot of emphasis. It's also true, as was pointed out, that the shares that have gone up have been in marketing and fundraising. And that was one reason why I spent some time in the book looking into the question of what orchestras got for their marketing and fundraising expenses. In the case of marketing, I basically already described the main conclusion, which is diminishing returns, which means you can't project what you're going to get from future marketing expenses by looking backwards. Now, in the case of fundraising, and I will confess, I came to this with a suspicion, which you're free to call a bias, from living in a university. Each year when I was in the dean's office of our business school, the fundraising people would come in and say, the total contributions to the school were, say, I'll make up a number, $1 million. Our budget was $100,000. How can you refuse a budget increase to a group that produces $10 for every $1 of our budget? And the problem with this, of course, is that universities and orchestras received lots of donations long before there were formal fundraising operations. Most orchestras, as near as I've been able to discover, never had fundraising until sometime in the 60s. So as part of my question, well, what do orchestras get out of fundraising? What I tried to do was relate the contributions that orchestras got to the economic basis of the community, the per capita income, the population, and so on, as a way of getting at the amount of funds that might have flowed in even without formal fundraising efforts, and then to add the actual expense that orchestras put into fundraising. Happily, the result was positive for large orchestras, that each dollar spent on fundraising, the incremental dollar, I should say, spent on fundraising would bring in about $1.60, as I recall. But by the late 90s, you did not get a statistical result indicating positive returns to fundraising in the smaller orchestras. And at this point, I'm not sure why that is the case. Under the terms of my agreement with the League, I'm not able to report data on individual orchestras, and that's one reason why the study is not disaggregated. But to me, that's a fascinating unresolved question as to why the returns to fundraising seem to be higher in larger orchestras than smaller orchestras.
This chart, Bob, the scatter diagram of risk and return on endowments is the one that most blows my mind.
Mine too.
Harry Markowitz and Bill Sharp must be saying the world was never that inefficient when we looked at it. What is this? What am I looking at? Are we saying that this is all in-house management that doesn't know what it's doing, that they don't go outside for professional management? What's going on here?
The best I can do is report on the testimony of people who have either managed endowments or watched endowments being management. These are people from universities and or arts organizations. And to a person, what they report, to put it bluntly, is some trustees cannot resist following their investment enthusiasms. And the net result is inefficiency. Some boards have people who have their own investment companies and would like some of the business. Others have friends who they would like to see get the business. And the people who are not consulted are the Nobel laureates you mentioned who actually know how to design an efficient investment portfolio.
Okay, let's take this as the last question.
Where the South Dakota Symphony again, the threshold between the larger orchestras that were getting the fundraising expenditures that were worth their while and smaller that were getting no effect, was that dividing line within those top 50 that you were analyzing, or was it somewhere between their level and?
Excuse me.
What sense of what you meant by smaller?
Yeah, good question. What I did was simply to have an equal-sized sample. I just divided it in half. Now, if some of the earlier remarks suggested there might be different pathologies for different groups of orchestras, and to the extent you could identify the different pathologies in which orchestras belonged in which group, you could define the group up differently. I don't know how that, obviously I don't know how that would change the result.
Okay, we have taken our full 75 minutes, and thank you so much, Bob, and
My
very
pleasure.
enlightening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.